good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're coming from. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Yoni Daron. I'm the Chief Strategic Partnership Officer at Branching Minds, and I'm very glad to be introducing Bonnie from Presence. Before I do, I just want to set off a few housekeeping items. One is if you scroll just below my video, there is a link to a PDF of the session slides. If you look to the right of my video where it says events, agenda, and session, please make sure that you're clicked on the session tab to engage with session presenters and attendees. And under the session tab, we encourage you to engage in the chat and to put any questions in the Q&A so we can address them at the end. Questions tend to get lost in the chat, so adding them in the Q&A is the best way to ensure they're addressed. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Bonnie. She will be delivering our presentation on counseling and behavioral, what's the name? Virtual connection, counseling and behavior. What is it? What's the technical title, Bonnie?
I'm gonna help you out there. Counseling and behavior supports in a teletherapy model. A lot of words.
It's a lot of words, but a lot of really good content. So with that, I will pass off to Bonnie, and thank you all for joining us.
All right, thank you, Yoni. Excited to share here. I see that we have someone joining from Nebraska and Utah. Caitlin, I'm actually a native Idahoan, so my guess is that your area code for your phone is 801. You tell me in the chat if I'm right. I love seeing that on my phone because I know where people are calling from. So quickly, just to introduce myself, as Yoni said, my name is Bonnie. I work with Presence, but am a school psychologist and worked in schools for approximately 10 years in a traditional placement, face-to-face with students. I'm a proud military spouse and had the opportunity to work in a lot of different locations, different states and districts, including rural, urban, and everything in between. So I came to Presence in 2018, first as a practitioner in a virtual support modality, and really was excited to have something that was going to be more portable for my lifestyle and would allow for some more continuity in my practice as a school psychologist. Since that time, I've had the opportunity to join the Presence team and serve in different clinical capacities within the company, and currently serve as our clinical partnership director, wherein I'm able to present to colleagues of mine. Oh, Caitlin, fabulous. I did get it right. 801, everyone. I'm able to join conversations like this, partners such as Branching Minds who are doing incredible work with MTSS supports, and really educate my peers and fellow educators about the application of virtual therapy and assessment, and really where it can fit to help really lengthen our reach to students. So this is a little quote here of mine that I have on my LinkedIn, but to say that I'm excited and passionate about teletherapy and virtual support for students would be an understatement. Part of that being that my skepticism was very high when first encountering this. And just sort of a fun story, I was working in Texas. Texas law can be very complicated around education, as I'm sure many of you could imagine. And I needed a little break and found the Presence table and struck up a lively conversation with someone who was there representing them, asking lots of hard-hitting questions that he was able to provide answers to and direct me to resources, and really found a high level of interest in pursuing that at the time. So just to off the top here, address a couple of terms and thoughts as far as incorporation of teletherapy. Much of this is about the shortages, specifically in schools. When we look at these school-based licensed clinical social workers, professional counselors that may exist in schools, school counselors, school psychologists, we know that the need exceeds the group that can provide these services. So how do we leverage existing resources? How do we reach more students with the workforce that we have available? And then also I'll be talking about what really is critical to identifying the success of a a virtual program, whether that includes a platform for usage, what would need to be available in that platform, what are some of the technical considerations, what do the logistics look like when working with the school in partnership if virtual providers are meeting with the students to provide virtual counseling and mental health support. So to address the goals of the session here real quickly, we'll talk a little bit about the good and the bad of teletherapy. Always really important to acknowledge, some of those implications. And though it's a fit for most students, we certainly want to acknowledge that this is not a replacement at large for in-person support. And so we'll talk a little bit about balancing those needs. What are the factors that may be motivating to students or schools and also professionals in the field to work within this space? I think for those in the workforce, some of the application and desires very obvious, but we'll talk a little bit about our experiences at present, some of my personal experience with students and some of the benefits to them of virtual counseling. We'll talk about consultation and really, again, what does that collaboration look like if you have someone working remotely, providing these critical services, but how are we able to generalize beyond maybe that session with the student, but provide support to the staff? They're generalizing vocabulary terms. We want the staff to know what some of their management needs might entail, and so that they're able to receive support globally within a school system, but not just in that isolated counseling session. And then also just the benefits of incorporating virtual mental health into a system and what that can look like. So one thing that I would challenge our listeners here at the top is to really rethink maybe our approach and our traditional model, and how maybe supports in school have existed. 15 years ago, when I first entered the field, it was a bit unusual, or it would have been a very progressive district at that time, to be seeking the provision of mental health counseling support for students in the gen ed environment that were not exhibiting an explicit need tied to their academic progression. And so we know that historically, the access to counseling support was dictated by special education qualification, and oftentimes even as specific as the category of emotional disability. With MTSS certainly leading out in the areas of academic support, and very quickly on the heels of that, recognizing that there was a place for mental health support within that intervention structure and triangle, that things have really started to change. And I think as then again, the needs of students have increased, particularly with the pandemic accelerating broad student need across really all ages of students, we've recognized that we need to make adjustments in how we serve these students, how we identify, how we prioritize, and what these actual services look like. So when we have our sort of traditional model, the student could seek out support from the school counselor if they're having, significant behavior concerns. They might be identified for potential evaluations for special education, but all these students in between that maybe aren't going to advocate, aren't going to go and seek out that support. How do we identify them, right? And so we have the deployment of universal screeners to determine maybe who of our students really are at risk, and so we can provide support to them. I think that then leads to this idea of a growth mindset of really being proactive about meeting these student needs. And I think that anxiety and depression and suicidality are certainly the top three concerns that I hear nationally in conversations that I have every day. But really honing in on the specific population, the specific school, and that student's needs, and to be proactive. I'll give an example here of support with a district that I was a direct provider for outside of Houston, Texas, and they very much wanted to take resources, counseling resources that had been used in a very reactive or punitive way, and shift to the front end. So a student for a referral to the office, let's say for vaping, for example, which to me is a significant contributor to the mental health challenges that our youth are experiencing. That there's really rampant addiction, and typically in schools, when we're looking at that addiction, we are coming in with a very punitive approach. We're not offering necessarily resources to support the student. And so if a student at this school outside of Houston came in with a referral, they were maybe caught vaping, they were given the option at that point of engaging in 3 counseling sessions, spread over 3 weeks, approximately 30 minutes. And in lieu of either suspension, depending on the number of infractions, once they started this program, the student could even avoid alternate placement. And without fail, every student that was given that option it just grabbed right onto that opportunity to be able to engage in that counseling and to avoid this sort of punitive response, which we know historically doesn't then provide a lot of opportunity for teaching and replacement behaviors, and is not necessarily as effective as we would like it to be. And so with this idea of very proactive supports in students' mental health, whatever the issue might be, vaping is a good example. I think, I challenge those of you listening about trying to think about what current resources exist and how they could maybe be shifted or loaded on the front end. When you start thinking about the personnel it takes for in-school suspension support, for alternate placement, that's a whole other, campus typically, and giving students some of that support up front where they can be seeking mental health support can be pretty significant. When we look at the placement of maybe those alternate strategies that are implemented, they absolutely can be tied to increased graduation rates, a decrease in absenteeism, an increase in academic performance, which within the MTSS model at large is important. It's important that we show efficacy. It's important that we have indicators to show that we have the outcomes that we've been seeking. And if not, that's the beauty of MTSS. We adjust and you can certainly refine those interventions and increase the level of support. So, as I was talking about the school in Texas specifically and some of the positive outcomes that they saw, particularly with an increase in graduation rates, when we think about mental health support and in a school-based model for mental health support, I really want to make the case for equating that to student success. I think in special education, we've done such a good job over time saying, the student has a need, it's affecting their academic performance. We need to put something in place and, to be able to show improvement and that we're making progress toward a goal. And, with really the at-large crisis for youth and mental health in our country, I think that the same argument can easily be made that if a student is given the supports that they need to manage, anxiety or trauma or whatever they might be experiencing, that by addressing that proactively in their school environment, we're going to see an improvement in their educational experience, which is certainly the primary goal of what we're doing there, but giving them those resources that they need. So just a few points here from the National Center on Safe Support Learning Environments. When schools provide these services, academic outcomes improve, discipline referrals are reduced, and attendance and graduation rates increase. So let's talk a little bit about what is, teletherapy. What would this virtual counseling for students look like? What's significant about the way that we're approaching this? So at the most basic level, when we consider teletherapy, it's about a high quality video and audio connection, making sure, that there's our devices available, that there's the appropriate bandwidth, that we're considering HIPAA and FERPA compliance in that school environment and abiding by any legal expectations. And then also resources and an interactive platform where you're able to engage with the student, that there can be appropriate pacing, there are appropriate materials, and an ability for the student to respond and engage. Just a quick note on teleassessment, because when we think about universal screeners that can be used for social emotional development in a pre and post fashion, we know that there is an assessment piece to that and maybe ongoing benchmarking and screening that occurs for mental health indicators for students. So just a few things to think about. If it were to be a direct assessment, which most of these would be a rating scale or would be completed by someone who knows the student well, but we want to ensure that if we're interacting directly with a student in an assessment fashion, that there's a live person on each end. That would be more for processing type measures, where we're working directly with the students with stimulus. That any content is licensed to be used, for that virtual interaction, or if it's in PDF format. And then also, again, those screening tools that can be used really with digital links. When we think about some of the basic social emotional screening tools to identify students for counseling, we think of maybe the BASC is probably the most common one, the Achenbach, if I have any old school people here on the call. But we'll be using those tools by sending the digital link to the stakeholders to the student if they're middle or secondary, to a parent, guardian, to a teacher, etc. So this is a slide that I really enjoy sharing, and it's really the why of what we would provide virtual counseling. Why are we trying to establish this virtual connection with students? And so I'll just touch on these briefly as we move through, but really the primary reason is creating access. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, it was very much the need right now is exceeding the workforce that can support students. But when you consider that there are individuals that can continue working in the field, even post-retirement in an education field, where they're able to work maybe a reduced number of hours, they can be living in any location that they would like, but still be able to meet with a student wherever that student is physically residing. So really it's a reallocation. We look at people that carry multiple state licensures that, I'm a good example of that as a military spouse, that I came to President's with 4 licenses, added a 5th, Indiana. There was some need for students in rural Indiana that were able to take a skill set that has always been tied to geographic and physical presence and really leverage that to a larger population. Another nice feature is this continuity of providers. And for students, a student that I was working with in Indiana had had some increasing behavior issues and was going to be moved to a different location in consideration of least restrictive environment. And I remember in the session prior to the student departing that campus, he was very distraught and concerned that he was not going to be able to continue meeting with me, right? Even though we were meeting virtually at that point. And I said to him, we're absolutely going to keep meeting. I'm like, I will see you at this time next week. You'll be sitting somewhere different, but I will be sitting right here. So the ability to continue to support students regardless of where they are physically residing, in a larger school district is really powerful, particularly when we think of very, geographically diverse school districts. It can be very significant to be able to stay with that student. To that point as well, when we think about the creation of groups for students, the ability to have students join from different locations, particularly when we look at maybe like a low incidence type of concern or trauma, to be able to connect those students virtually is very powerful, that they're not interacting with that peer in the physical environment, but they're able to come to that group and have that discussion in a virtual environment. It's really powerful. Certainly giving access to specialists. One thing that we continue to strive to do at Presence is identify the specific skill sets, trainings, and interests of our providers, of our social workers, of our school psychologists and counselors. And if they have a specific area of expertise, working to connect them with students of need, whether that be, students, minority students, refugee students, students that identify as LGBTQ, that we really want to be able to continue to refine that process of matching to the specific needs that are presenting and a specific skill set of that counselor. Certainly a reduction in time and travel. Any school district that I worked in, the smallest number of schools that I was ever assigned to as a school psychologist was 3. And there wasn't always rhyme and reason and keeping me maybe on one side of town. So there was a lot of movement. And though you always call ahead and want to make sure that the student's there to meet, the number of times that I called, and this was the name that would always hang me up, is Jaden from Miss class? Oh yeah, Jaden's here. I get there. Oh, I thought you meant Jaden from the other class, or Caden. Or you get there, you're ready to work, the student's not there. And that has a pretty significant impact that accumulates over the school year. Whereas virtually, we're able to meet with students quickly, one after another. We can pivot quickly, meet with a different student if one is absent or not available. And I think overcoming the barriers to miss sessions, I've addressed with this. The workforce-driven wants I've touched on as well. From my personal experience as a military spouse and really wanting that continuity, but for people that aren't necessarily wanting full-time employment, and there's a broad group that's appealing to, for individuals that want to live in a certain location, but are more than willing to support students in higher demand areas and provide those services is significant. And just a note on the student-driven considerations, the power of meeting with a professional that the student is not interacting with in their physical environment, that they're not seeing on a regular basis in their school, particularly for mental health. So I'll isolate this comment specifically to counseling support, is really substantial, is something that students again and again report to us that I like being able to talk to you. I feel more confident in talking to you because I don't see you in the hallway. I don't see you in the community. So, there's a lot of sort of building evidence that our ability to build rapport as practitioners with students virtually can even really be accomplished faster than some of the challenges we're working to overcome in that physical environment. I would also challenge everyone on the call to think a little bit about their maybe own concerns or prejudices as it relates to virtual supports for students. And what I have found in 3 years of evangelizing about this approach is almost without fail, the major objections that I encounter are from staff and maybe based on their own thoughts and experience, not from the students. So I want everybody to think about that. The majority of students, will excel and do very well in this environment. Many of those students will prefer the virtual interaction. And so just things to consider that the end user of this virtual counseling service, the student, does not typically have, the concerns or have to overcome certain objections to be able to engage in the service. My job really is to help my peers and colleagues see that value and to report what I've heard from students as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the cons and sort of be frank about some of the challenges. It's not a foolproof approach, and I think COVID across the board, considering teletherapy services, highlighted that painfully, right? For a whole nation, world to have to pivot sort of simultaneously and try to engage virtually was very challenging. Presence is 14 years in and has really developed a lot of best practices that are applicable to the field at large. And so it is important to really consider, is this the best fit? What does this look like logistically? How do we incorporate this into our current systems of support for students? It is not a universal replacement. This is where I like to highlight, again, that it is a great fit for most students, but there are important considerations, for counseling in particular. When we think of a student that has really known aggression and maybe sort of explosive behavioral tendencies, this is probably not ideal. They need to be working with a device. We often, would like them to maybe have headphones on. That can be agitating to some students, so we want to consider that. We also, certainly students that have known elopement issues, and I love that elopement is only a word used in education in Las Vegas, but students that are going to leave, they're going to elope from the location. If they're not willing to stay at the device to have that interaction, it's not going to, probably go as well. And also certain disabilities where there's known cognitive impairment implications, it can be a little bit more challenging, and needing sort of that tactile interaction with students with that profile can be very important. In consideration of those thoughts, though, it's important to know that it absolutely can be done in a very competent manner, again, when accounting for considerations. Another note on the assessment piece, as I had mentioned earlier, some of those considerations, that having valid research for any type of direct assessments, within an MTSS or within a special education qualification model, there are some really important aspects that research has indicated to ensure that we have that equivalency of what a face-to-face administration would entail and what that virtual interaction would look like. All right, so let's talk a little bit about best practice and the literature at large. So I always encourage school-based personnel or practitioners to refer to any association guidelines. For the majority of practitioners in schools, that is school psychologists, and that would be then under NASP. And they have some really good information. They have some position papers that talk again about sort of the critical considerations. American Psychological Association, also great. What's very interesting to me, having joined Presence, is that the establishment of telehealth medical interaction really exceeds what we've done in schools and has been a good model for us to follow. And I would guess that those of you listening, probably the majority, if not all of us, have participated in a virtual doctor appointment. And so I always think about, we have sort of an established confidence for that level of interaction. And that really does indicate that this can be done, well for school-based needs. Considering any research or methodology, again, particularly with the equivalency of assessments, anecdotal information, things that I'm sharing with you today with my firsthand experiences, particularly having been in a traditional face-to-face employment position for 10 years and then shifting into the virtual. Publisher requirements are important. Owning a physical copy does not always translate to the ability to embed that digitally. And so that's sort of also simultaneously being addressed right now, but just be sort of conscious and considerate of what those publisher agreements entail with presence, because we have a very large network of practitioners and an independent proprietary platform. And it's a process to establish those relationships, place that information, give access to groups, etc. And then also case studies. At NASP last year in Denver, I attended a student case study paper where they were talking about sort of the compared counseling aspects of working with students in person, virtually. It was very interesting. I'll be excited this next February in New Orleans to see sort of where graduate programs and students are at. And I will say that one of my passion projects is to try and help build up an awareness in graduate programs. What we find at Presence is that individuals are coming to us and didn't have a lot of exposure about the provision of virtual counseling and supports in their graduate programs. And we're providing a lot of that, but I'm certain that will change, and I hope to be part of that in the ensuing years. And then again, as a note on any assessment related to counseling needs, that it's much about the modality change. And in fact, with remote assessment, it's very much about adjustments in the examiner experience, but really keeping the student experience intact as it would be in a face-to-face interaction. All right, let's talk a little bit about virtual consultation and what that looks like when you're implementing remote counseling for your students. What does that collaboration look like? So just as if that individual were physically in the district and residing, and so much of what we do, even when we're in the same district, is via email, is via telephone calls, or joining a Zoom meeting from our different schools. It really looks very much the same. A virtual school psychologist is bringing that depth of expertise in system establishment, in screening, in prioritizing. And then it's really about collaborating with that expert, but with the school's needs, just as if you were there in person. So the identification and prioritization in consideration of maybe that tier 1 established support for the school wide. What is the vocabulary we're using in the school? What are the behaviors that we're looking to model? We want to build off the school. If there's a check-in, check-out program that's already been established, either at a tier 1 or at a more targeted level at tier 2 for very specific student behaviors, we want to know about that. And as a virtual provider, any virtual provider is going to want to know about that. That's one of the first questions when we partner with schools I always ask is, do you have a check-in, check-out program? Do you have a sheet? Do you have the language that you want us to reinforce and provide to that student, so there's continuity of expectations to the student? The support of that tiered system development. Branching Minds, again, does such an incredible job with bringing in that structure, a means of tracking data, recommendations for interventions, and continuing to sort of refine and iterate on that system is important. And certainly a school-based mental health provider, when it comes to counseling, is going to be the expert in helping to continue to improve that tiered system. Another really critical aspect of this is the communication with the teacher that is working to support the student all day. And so when you have the virtual support being provided, particularly if it's tied to maybe a more direct or explicit behavior plan, we want to make sure that whatever's being discussed, supports that are working well for the students, strategies that have been communicated, that the teacher's aware of that, and that any sort of advice or support that can be provided to the student, that's given, so they're able to implement that support. And so again, I always say that whatever it looks like on the ground, it can look very, very close, if not often the same, with that virtual interaction, but it's just going to require the email, the phone call, or the Zoom meeting. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, in my experience with Presence, sort of what this counseling looks like virtually. So typically for virtual supports from any provider, whether it be presence or otherwise, um, it really can be critical at that tier 2 where we step in and we know the students have been identified. There's been a benchmark, there's been a risk screener, and we have students identified, and they're ready to, be referred and receive that support. And again, for that collaboration with the school staff. And I think the power of school-based mental health and school psychologists and school social workers in particular is really an understanding of this model and what this looks like in a school system, and being able to discern when we've probably hit that tipping point for a student to be evaluated for a formal categorical eligibility in special education, and maybe for some very specific IEP counseling goals that are going to be longer term. And, I think at this point, the need is so wide that any mental health that can be provided in school, whether it's more of a medical model and something that runs sort of in tandem or parallel to a school, is wonderful. But I will continue to really profess the importance of the expertise of being able to step into a school system and understand really the much larger goal and scope of what we're trying to accomplish in an academic environment, and how the mental health and counseling of students can really then feed into that support as well. All right, let me just check time here. I'm a chatterbox, as you guys have probably gathered. So with mental health counseling and behavior interventions, let's talk maybe about what that really looks like for the student, and that student needing extra support. So of the bullet points here, we'll just talk through these briefly, but when we talk about individual counseling, that's going to be one-on-one, that's going to be student specific, that is going to be really about an identified issue that the student either has brought forth and they're advocating for support. It certainly could be from a teacher, it could be from a parent or guardian. I always say that, universal screeners are critical, but we want to also really open this up for students to be able to seek out that support when they've recognized a need that they have. And then obviously, the parent, guardians, and teachers as well, to say, this is what I'm seeing. These are the behavior changes that I've noticed. These are the comments that the student's making, or even the student coming forward and saying, I'm feeling different. I'm not feeling like myself. I quit the basketball team. I used to love basketball. If I heard a student saying that, I would, immediately my alarm bells would be going off. But a student that can come in and advocate and know that there's a space for them to share that really is going to be an excellent candidate for that individual targeted counseling for a period of time to address that immediate issue and really get them back on track. Hopefully, they'll return to doing well in school. They'll join the team next year or return to the team. When we're able to sort of, see the students speaking to their needs, I always would say to students, you are the expert on you, and you can give me information that no one else can really provide. They can be concerned, they can see things, but tell me where you're struggling. What do you see as a miss right now? The development of behavioral interventions really goes hand in hand with that. It's interesting. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but there certainly is a distinction between sort of that counseling need. And I often think of it as internalizing versus externalizing. The student who's internalizing, so we're not really seeing, we're not aware unless they're articulating that concern, is really going to be a great fit, I think, for that counseling, particularly in a cognitive behavioral therapy approach. When we have a student that has a lot of externalizing concerns, and there is, harm, violence, threat to the physical environment, refusal to work, all sorts of things. Absenteeism is another one, that having a very structured behavior intervention plan with increasing levels of support for that student is important. Conducting social emotional evaluations, which can include, as we've mentioned, screeners, rating scales, also student interviews, other stakeholders to interview. To me, the power of an interview with a student, and this would be most appropriate middle and high school certainly, though elementary students, it never ceased to amaze me sometimes how prescient and aware they were of their needs and what was going on around them. But having that interview aspect as part of that larger evaluation. And then certainly, as we've talked about, meeting the needs of students with the counseling or behavior specific goals on the IEP. And it is, it is a continuum. We know that the triangle, I think sometimes we think of it, we just increase in intensity, but the beauty really of that tier 2 is that we have a lot of flexibility to increase, adjust, and make changes as we need to. All right, so just a quick check. You can absolutely drop this in the chat if you would like to, or just be thinking. But number one, what factors do you consider for a valid in-person therapy or assessment? So for you to feel that there is efficacy for interaction with a student, what do you feel like would be critical or imperative? I'll give you just a moment to think about that and then share. And then in addition to that, how can these needs be met in a virtual interaction? So I think one of the best examples is, for it to be successful in person, we want to be developmentally aware. If we're working with a younger student, we want to make sure that we have the, ability to do shorter sessions, that we have the appropriate materials for that student, particularly for early education. Having engaging, relevant materials of high interest is really, really important. That, to the point of number 2, how this can be met in a virtual interaction is exactly the same. I'll sometimes have people say, well, I couldn't do a 30-minute counseling session with a kindergartner. I'm like, neither could I, right? So we know that face-to-face, maybe twice a week, 15 minutes, much more appropriate. The same would apply to the virtual environment, that we would consider shorter sessions more frequently. When we think about materials for the student, working as a school psychologist, which I refuse to get rid of any of my hard copy materials. So there's boxes back over here behind me. Having things that are meaningful, that can be incorporated quickly, that you can shift to. Having that access to a digital reserve is equally important, that there are resources, activities, appropriate curriculums that can be used. One curriculum that we utilize is the Tiny Guides curriculum with Rosalind Wiseman, and it's phenomenal. There's sort of these independent lessons that are embedded in the Presence platform. One of my favorites is a lesson on self-compassion, and really appropriate for a wide range of students and their ages. But going through, giving the student the vocabulary, having graphics, having little exercises that we're able to do and answer questions, important face-to-face, and also really important in the virtual interaction. All right, so what does it all mean? Let's sort of tie up what you need to consider, what you need to be looking for if this is something that you think might be beneficial for the students that you support. So important factors for consideration, and we'll go through these bullet points independently, but the physical environment, supervisory considerations, and that would be physical supervision of the student in the actual location. Instruments and resource selection, the physical equipment needed, and then the selection of students that would benefit from this interaction. So in the physical environment, it's important for the virtual counselor to be able to, assess the appropriateness of that. So in collaboration with the school, a site, location is typically determined. For counseling, it's very important that that be private. When we think about speech therapy, occupational therapy, sometimes there's a little bit more leeway for a location in a classroom, but it's really critical with the counseling that the student have the confidence to have that interaction. Obviously, prior to virtually meeting this student, we want to assess and be familiar with what the concerns are, and have been part of that MTSS process and having access for a record review, just as we would if we were in the physical environment. And then also, students are receiving services not always at school. I have it mentioned here in the second data point that the home environment certainly is a location. So we want to be cognizant of that. Are there siblings there? Is there an adult in the home environment? So we know that there is a safety piece and supervision for the child. And again, just making sure that the location is conducive, who will be there to support the student, and what materials we may need. And we'll talk about the equipment here in just a moment. So the supervisor, those considerations here, there's really an application across the board for student services. I have an SLP and a CODA listed here, but when we think about the support for a student when they're receiving virtual counseling, it is at the highest level just about the safety of the student. the individual providing oversight in the physical environment does not stay with the student, but they need to be accessible. They need to have eyes on either the door where the student is, or very close proximity at secondary levels. Sometimes there's a little more leeway, but typically the expectation is that the student either is, the adult in the physical environment. We call it a primary support person, but they would go and get the student, bring them to that location, make sure that the student connects, there's not any technical issues that need to be resolved, and then would excuse themselves. But it's imperative that the counseling provider, has access to that individual, that they can be introduced into the room if there's any concern, and the student also can check out with that individual before heading back to class. So if I were providing counseling and there were a threat of harm to others, I would need to introduce that person to the physical space. As the counselor, I would continue to facilitate that discussion, make decisions on what the crisis plan would look like. Do we need to call in crisis support? Do we need to, maybe leverage ground on the support there? Again, as the private provider of that, I would contact the parents. If the parents need to come to the school, if the student needs to be moved to a higher level of support to help manage that. But the immediate safety of that student physically is really critical, and we need to be conscientious of that. As far as being trained, it's pretty basic. I'm speaking to y'all through my Mac right now. Laptop, PC, Chromebook for therapy, tablets can be used as well. And this would be in consideration of using a platform to interact with the students, sort of the platform that we're in right now for the session. Zoom, Google Meets, the Presence platform is specifically designed for the delivery of these services and has different components. But we want to make sure that if it's a younger student, that we have an individual there that, again, can provide any technical support, that they can communicate clearly with the provider, and that they can follow any instructions that I, as the clinician, might have for them. And then again, in a home environment, still can work well, but we would want that parent in the home environment to, again, be cognizant of the need that if there were concern, they may need to be introduced into the conversation. I see a question here from Sarah Gentry, and it says, how do you address scenarios where immediate risk to safety might be disclosed in a virtual session? Is there a system in place? Sarah, you were reading my mind. I don't know if I was reading that with my right eye when you were typing that, but hopefully I answered that for you. I will say, Sarah, that it is really dictated by each. Oh, thank you, Sarah. It is really dictated by each school. When a virtual provider, whether it be through Presence or another provider, joins that school, it's imperative that they familiarize themselves with the school crisis plan. And with the exception of needing to introduce that primary support person into the physical space, the expectation is that the professional is going to facilitate the supports for the student. If that's some type of an agreement letter, we're going to write up a safety letter, and we're going to talk about, if I start feeling this way, I'm going to do this. That would all still be managed in that virtual space. Certainly, if there's an acceleration of behavior and the student's not able to engage on the screen anymore, at that point, it's very much just about the safety of the student. And then at that point, certainly contacting parents or guardians, and then the consideration of a mobile crisis unit if the student is needing hospitalization or higher level of support. So in talking about assessments and resources, again, what am I using in these sessions? What are the curriculums? What is the school using? Should I be incorporating that? Just making sure that there's a research base when we look at any type of assessments. We want to really be conscientious, again, of the modality impact on what we're trying to accomplish. One thing that's actually very interesting, and I think this group will appreciate, is remote observations of the student are really powerful. And I'll give just sort of a brief explanation of what that can look like. But through the Presence platform, what we're able to do is utilize just a basic gooseneck camera in the classroom environment, and then obtain a live feed, not being recorded, but a live feed to observe. And we have the ability to stop the screen on the classroom side. So it's just like a laptop sitting open, essentially with a large gray block. And so any walking by, it would not look out of place at all. But on my side, virtually, I'm able to have a Jumbotron large screen view of what's happening in that classroom, audio and visually. And it's very powerful in overcoming the Hawthorne effect, which is the observer impact to my presence in the physical space of the student. And so just, again, when you're thinking about sort of assessing students for their needs, if you're wanting to determine progress, particularly if it's a behavioral concern tied to their counseling support, being able to observe remotely is really powerful. And if there's any fellow nerds on the call, conducting an FBA remotely is actually magic. And I would hit me up on LinkedIn and I'll explain that to you. All right, so security of materials is important. We talked a little bit about publisher requirements earlier. That certainly is applicable to assessment tools as well. What is that primary supporter proctor person? What is their role? What is the expectation? Clearly communicating that to them before. The equipment needed, laptop, PC, Chromebook, but do we need a document camera? Are we going to try to observe the student? Do we want the student to have headphones on just, to ensure can the student tolerate the headphones? All of these things, I still use a mouse. Most people, kids seem fine with trackpads, but just considering what's going to make it most conducive for the student in that physical environment. And then certainly the interactivity and, again, the curriculums that are available. Not only do we want to be showing information, for example, right now I'm sharing my slides. You see me sitting here in my office in Kentucky, but we want to really be able to interact. We want the student to be able to drop, drag, draw, place a stamp, use a spinner, to be able to chat with us, to be able to have a word processing feature where, we could do a journal entry with them. And in fact, one thing that I love doing with secondary students was starting the session, having a journal prompt on a co-word processing feature and, giving the student maybe 3 minutes to respond. And I was able to observe sort of the completion of that. We would be able to talk about that entry in real time. Sometimes they would share some really powerful, thoughtful information. They wanted a copy of that. I was able to export that as a PDF and provide that to them. And then just a note on certainly, font and visual sizing, we want it to be of an appropriate size. When we think about the use of phones for the application of virtual counseling, that is not something beyond older secondary students that really has taken root. For me, particularly when we look at proactive counseling, right? For a reactive emergent need, being able to talk to someone is critical. But when we talk about a multi-tiered system of support and wanting to meet the needs of students, it's very much about being intentional with what we're providing to them, and again having that interactivity, having an appropriate screen size. And so we want to make sure that the student's able to see, able to participate. Having the feature to increase the font size for students with known visual impairments actually can be really powerful as well. I actually have trained a lot of people at Presence, and so I had a lot of seasoned practitioners ask me, I can just make the font bigger on my side so I can see it more clearly. I'm like, you can, but it will also do that on the student side. So I suggest maybe a stronger prescription. But we want to be able to certainly meet those needs of students, maybe with lower incidence disabilities. All right, talking about physical equipment, and I basically hit on this in the last one, but and then are there other items? Are there actual physical items that might be needed in the student environment as far as manipulatives? Or I had one student that had a journal that they would want to bring and share. And so they provided to them a document camera on their side, and the student could actually then show me on screen, which was really neat. And I actually, the power of art for so many students, whether they're gifted artists or not. I had students that often would want to bring and show those items or be drawing in real time in maybe a sketchbook that they brought. So that can be really powerful tool. Showing them the ability within our platform to draw and use those items could be really neat as well. But I just have found over years and years that students who we invest in and we want to know what they're good at and what their interests are, and giving them the means to show us that, gosh, it's so powerful. All right, let's skip ahead to student selection. So these are just some of the considerations, and we've touched on some of these, but again, it's much more about maybe a small number of considerations for students who are not going to be able to manage or adapt in this environment, and being cognizant of those needs versus the reality that the majority of students do very well. The ability to attend is important. We talked a little bit about elopement, and that's here on the third bullet, but we want to make sure that it's meaningful and engaging. And there certainly are students that are not going to want to be on screen. Having the ability in a platform to cut the screen for the student side, but the students still see the counselor and the students still have audio can be really powerful to overcome that. Giving the student the option to use a text function to respond to a question, particularly if it's a sensitive issue and they're having a hard time articulating maybe their feelings about it. Some of these others we've talked about, when we consider low cognitive abilities, And then also remember the advantages that we can connect with clinical specialties, meet the needs of minority populations. And then, the application for rural districts is always really interesting to me, and they were early adopters for obvious reasons. But I always like to share this story. We partner with several districts in Alaska, including districts that cover what are called village schools, that are very remote but do have internet access. And I was speaking to a director one day, and we were talking about some students and some onboarding, and someone came into her office, and I did not hear what they said to her. But she leaned in and she said, "The plane is here. I have to leave to the school." Jumped up, grabbed her heavy parka, threw it on, chair was spinning, and she was gone out the door. So when you think about some of the challenges of rural districts, just to get to students, and I don't know that she was regularly hopping on the small plane to go and see these students at locations, but the ability to overcome that through a virtual connection and give student supports, particularly I always enjoy the conversations with Alaska because the specific needs of their student native populations are really unique. And having someone that has the skill set and the training to come in and provide support to those students is not something even 10 years ago I think we really could have conceived as working well, and meeting the needs of those students. All right, just a couple of additional thoughts here. I know we're getting closer to time. Things to resolve by district, and these are sort of more logistical questions, but oftentimes for attendees to these types of sessions, they are things that people are curious about. So as far as consent for students, when you think of the tier 2 targeted intervention, and we're considering what students at that level need, and we know it's going to be specialized, obviously consent applies. What that looks like with a virtual practitioner is really dictated by the district and their procedures. It can come directly from the district on behalf of the provider. The provider may be reaching out to parents to secure that consent. Either way is fine. I say, particularly when we look at tier 3 in special education, when in doubt, PWN, give a prior written notice. And I found it very beneficial as a virtual practitioner to give a PWN specific to the modality of treatment. Your student will be meeting with me virtually. Though I reside in Kentucky, I carry a full license in Indiana, and would be allowed to work in schools there. I will be serving the student through a proprietary platform. Really just educating the parents can be so powerful in helping them see the value for their student. And honestly, any parent that has that level of interest, I will talk to them all day long. I think people on the call could probably agree that the greater challenge is engaging parents, but I always try to really, again, give that informed consent. When we look at progress reporting, it can be very important, such as a system with Branching Minds, where we're looking at that data. We have the data points, we're showing the graphing, we're showing the improvements, so capturing that information. I myself use a SOAP note format, so we're looking at the subjective, objective, the assessment of that session, then what's the plan moving forward. The team collaboration, which we've touched on, but again, being part of that larger team. Most schools have a designated committee for the MTSS tiered process. I feel like I should have, also given the PBIS RTI explanation at the beginning, but I've bought into the MTSS as far as sort of the global explanation for what we do. But being part of that team, whatever its name might be, to contribute. If reports are required, whether that is tied to specific progress reporting or best practice with an MTSS is that we still are giving those sort of regular reporting updates on the progress of the student, whether that's done with benchmarking, whether it's a rescreen for an at-risk screener, that we're communicating that with the team and participating there. All right, so in consideration of how you're connecting with students, these are things that I would just encourage you to be mindful of, things that are really imperative to the success of this. Now, with COVID, there was the retrofitting of Zoom, of Google Meets, etc., but the very intentional creation of platforms that are meant for the delivery of students in a school-based environment, meeting their specific needs. It's critical that there is the interactivity, obviously abiding by the security, again, for the HIPAA and FERPA compliance. we want to consider the fluidity, the quality, again, of the video and the audio interaction and that streaming component. Prior to working with schools, Presence always conducts a tech check, and we have on-demand tech support to make sure that we're able to address those issues. The user interface, that both the student and the practitioner are comfortable interacting in that environment. And so, though it's a fairly easy lift for students, Presence provides for practitioners coming into the virtual side of the field a lot of onboarding and training support for how to take their important skill set. But how do you do that as a virtual practitioner? How do you navigate fluidly in a virtual platform with the student as you're delivering information, as you're keeping session notes, as you're determining where you want to follow up, etc. Bandwidth considerations are important, certainly the hardware and software that we've talked about. And then for activities and assessments, it's really critical that it be embedded. What we don't want to be doing in a virtual interaction is the following, and I actually love that this is what I have to show you, is holding something up to the screen. We have to make sure that it's mirroring correctly. We have to make sure that it's mirrored to the student correctly. This is the communicate, which Yoni and I, who introduced me, were talking. He mentioned this, and I'm like, I have it sitting right here. And fun, it is MTSS implementation, navigating the practical challenges. I got it in the mail. I was like, that is on my to-do list to read this. So what we want to make sure is that the student has the items on the screen, that we know the orientation is correct, that holding something up, trying to get it to the screen, trying to make sure that the student can clearly see that is really going to present a lot of challenges and slow the process. So material needs to be embedded, again, with that interactive overlay. All right, so things to consider as far as engagement for students. A word on curriculums. I think that the power of having a good, maybe trauma-informed curriculum or something tied to, grief support is really powerful for students. I, as a virtual practitioner, always ask the school, what did they have already existing? Did they have second step? And that was something I could build off with the students into that targeted intervention. The flexible workspace, the documentation, a lot of this we've touched on. Administrative oversight, I do want to mention. For those on the call, or those who are supporting students in schools, being able to have insight into the session support for the student is really important. Primarily, did the student attend, right? Like keeping track of who's attending sessions, of absences, and being mindful of who's receiving services, who's not. What was discussed in the group that's appropriate to share back with stakeholders in the school environment? What was the general response of the student? Were they attentive? Were they, rolling their eyes and, not really even giving eye contact to the practitioner? So having a means to communicate to the school side, whether that be, the committee that's managing MTSS. Oftentimes, as a school psychologist providing direct counseling services, my partner in crime would be the school counselor, and she was helping sort of manage some of that data and what's happening and communicating some expectations to others in the school environment. So at the end of the day, I feel like I'm a superstar on time here. Training is key, and this is a sort of a high level exposure. But for the school, supporting them in the implementation is critical. Supporting the practitioner, supporting the student as they're learning what this landscape looks like and how virtual counseling can exist. The informed consent and documentation, always important, no matter what we're doing. That regardless of it being evaluation or direct service, that we're considering multiple data points. These are just sort of best practice indications. Controlling, observing, and documenting the student environment as much as possible. I have only had in probably I change the number all the time, but we'll say a nice even number of 500. And 500 demonstrations, presentations, discussions where I have presented this material over the years now. I have only had one person that kept making the case and argued that it was imperative that they see the student's legs. And I'm like, well, when we're physically with the student, we're typically sitting at maybe a kidney table or a triangular table and having that interaction. But it is important to always have those visual feeds. Obviously, you're seeing me now. I can't see all of you. I would love to, but being able to observe that student in this space and their environment and what's happening. And we know that fire drills happen, and we know that assemblies happen, and we know that students can be agitated if they're not able to go to the events that are planned in the school environment. And then, nothing can really replace professional judgment. And I'll sort of end on that point. I think, again, determining the students that are appropriate parents and guardians that are amenable, staff that wants to collaborate, that all makes this a success, and the professional judgment needed to determine and prioritize students that will really excel with these virtual counseling services and that are a great fit is really critical and is tied to that expertise and training. All right, here are some resources that you can refer to if you would like. And as Yoni said, these slides are attached. Really appreciate those of you that joined today. Hope that it was helpful information. As I mentioned, I'm on LinkedIn, Bonnie Contreras, and bonnie.contreras@presence.com. If you had any additional questions or wanted to reach out, I'm always happy to communicate with colleagues. All right, so I will go ahead and I don't see additional questions in the chat. Go ahead and close this out. I know there are other sessions starting. Oh, there's Yoni. Yoni, I was getting ready to do the wrap up, so I'll hand it off to you, Yoni, to give some information to the group.
That's it. Thank you so much, Bonnie. We really appreciate it. We hope folks will continue with the rest of today's summit. We have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Claudia Rinaldi, who will be speaking later today. I'll be introducing her. And I think there are some more sessions between now and then, but looking forward to seeing everyone. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Thanks, Yoni.